Good afternoon, friends. Darren McClellan here for another Wednesday afternoon edition of the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Welcome to Fairhope. We're glad to have you with us today as we continue our engagement of the latter chapters of Luke's Gospel. What we know now is that the journey of Jesus with his disciples, when he turned his face toward Jerusalem, has now come to a place where all of these issues are really starting to intensify. And the fervor of conflict and the animosity and the testing that Jesus is beginning to undergo is elevated to a much heightened state. What we have paid attention to in our study all along the way is recognizing what other scholars have referred to as this great reversal that takes shape within Luke's gospel. If you've ever, in your discussions, and I know many of you have, we have these conversations all the time where we say, man, it just feels like everything in the world is just upside down right now, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's politics, whether it's economics, whether it's values or virtues, everything just feels out of whack. It feels completely upside down. Well, if you've ever shared those frustrations, concerns, or sentiments, then I invite you to hear the good news from the Gospel of Luke. Because from the very beginning, we recognize that Jesus is one who comes to turn everything upside down in orientation to the coming kingdom. This sounds like good news for many. It will also involve maybe some heartburn for others, because what we also realize is that if things are going to get better, well, that's going to involve change, isn't it? How often we've said to ourselves in one way or another, I just want things to get better so long as nothing in my world changes, right? Right? Well, guess what? It doesn't work that way. And so when we engage this change faithfully, what we have to ask ourselves in the discernment of reading this scripture for us through these many weeks and months and over the course of our lives is to say, okay, God, which one of these stories is directed towards something that I need to hear? This is your living word, after all. So what is it in me that I need to consider? What is it about my will or my perception or even my perspective that might be radically altered if I were to take this invitation of Jesus seriously? And at the same time, what are those places that we dare not change? What are those things that we need to hold on to and make sure that we communicate them for successive generations as a part of the gospel narrative? Jesus is clear as a part of his own directive that his good news is going to be good news for the poor, good news for the oppressed, to offer recovery of sight to the blind, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. So all of those who are not in a place of great power or prestige or wealth or status or what have you are not necessarily those to whom Jesus is providing the whole of his ministry. He has good news offered for the rich man, but he also comes with a directive for Lazarus. We remember that as well. So which part of this story applies to us? These are dangerous questions that we have sought to answer very prayerfully in our reflection together. Today, we enter into what is perhaps the third series of confrontations that engage Jesus in the area surrounding the temple. We remember last week 2 episodes. One, an initial confrontation with the chiefs and the scribes, right, who were testing him, who were asking these questions. They came to test him. Tell us why, what authority, they asked, are you doing these things? And we know, because Luke tells us very clearly, that so many of the tests that Jesus was engaging were against those who were desperately finding some way or trying to find some way to kill him, right? I mean, the very idea that he's proclaiming this reversal of power and this reversal of the structure is enough to raise the ire of those who are in a place of control and influence. Once it moves, and that includes the religious authorities in particular. And so interesting to watch the dynamics that play out sociopolitically between the Jewish community and the religious leaders there, but also this influence of the empire and the way that it engages this as the establishment of power. And that great exchange between Pilate and the crowds, who says, I can't find anything wrong with him. I'll give him back to you. And the Jews said, no, give us Barabbas. We'll see that story coming up pretty soon. But as it is for today, there have been initial confrontations with the scribes and the Pharisees. There have been an additional, second episode of questioning about the issue of paying taxes, right? The attempt to, we couldn't move on him in such a way to want to kill him. So now we'll see if we can just make a fool out of him in the public square. And so they asked this question about the dynamics of Rome, saying, is it lawful to pay taxes? And Jesus' response was, you give to Caesar what's Caesar's, you give to God's what's God's. And the reference there, the verse 26, simply says that they were amazed by his answer and they became silent. Well, those groups may have become silent, but just as sure as Jesus is able to close the mouths of one set of critics and adversaries, you can rest assured that another set is going to be right over the horizon coming their way. If that's true for Jesus, it's likely true for many of us as well. Here it is in verse 27 that the Sadducees are introduced on the scene. Verse 27 in the 20th chapter of Luke's Gospel reads thusly: Some Sadducees, those who say there is no resurrection, came to him and asked him a question. And it's a long, confounded question. The Sadducees are a group of Jewish folk within the life of the temple. And what is perhaps most notable, as Luke mentions it here, in the differentiation, the distinction between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, is that the Pharisees, in their reading of the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures that is, gave reference to the notion of a resurrection. The Sadducees did not share this view of the resurrection. They looked wholly, exclusively, at the first 5 books of the Torah, those first 5 books of the Old Testament, as a way of determining their sense of theology. And within their reading of the Torah, of those first 5 books, they did not see any evidence, suggestion, or other teaching of the notion of resurrection. And so, in some ways, wanting to dismantle this notion of a resurrected body or what that resurrection looks like, as they understood Jesus to be teaching it, they mean to lean in specifically to him on this particular idea. And what is undoubtedly the corniest preacher joke of all time, or maybe not all time, there's a lot to choose from, but one of the cornier preacher jokes is that the easy way to remember this is that the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection, therefore they were sad, you see. I know, I didn't make it up, but it does help me to remember it, even in the life of our studies now. Don't be a Sadducee. And of course, our children's choruses have sung these anthems as well. Wanting to, again, test Jesus in his interpretation and to make a case for just how impossible this notion of a resurrection would be while still upholding the sense of the law, the Sadducees lean in with this very complicated question that ought to send many of us perhaps aghast because it is very different than some of our contemporary sensibilities around the issue of marriage. The Sadducees are leaning into this doctrine of what is known as levirate marriage, which is the idea that if someone has a wife and that someone, being a male specifically, dies, then it would be beholden to the brother to then take that woman, that widow, to be his wife, primarily not for the sake of marital bliss, but in the interest of procreation, of continuing the line of ancestry on behalf of his brother. Now, if this doesn't sound like the most egalitarian setup you could imagine, you're absolutely right about that. And I believe that Luke has something to say about our sense of that too, here as we'll see in a moment in Jesus' response. But listen to the complexity of this question that is posed to Jesus, because it takes me 3 times to read it through just to even track what it is that they're asking. So kudos to our Lord for being able to think on his feet here. But verse 28, they asked him a question. Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, all right, keep track of this, one brother dies, leaving a wife but no children, the law says that the man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. So that would be brother number 2. Now, the man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Verse 29, now there were 7 brothers. The first married and died childless. Then the second and the third married her. I don't know what kind of line of work these boys were in, but obviously it was dangerous. The first married and died. The second married her and died. The third married her and died. The same way, all 7, I'm running out of fingers now, married this woman and died. I feel terrible for this woman, right? That's interesting, little awkward family reunion for sure. Finally, the woman also died, at which point she was probably relieved after all of that life. And in the resurrection, this is the question. In the resurrection, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 had married her. Now, is this a real story or is this hypothetical? Who knows? When you first read it a couple of times, it's like that word, problem in math class. Train A leaves the station at such and such miles an hour at such and such time, and train B leaves at this such and such time, and which one will get across town in enough time to pick up lunch for everybody that's involved. I was never very good at those questions in math class. Those word problems were tough. And this is the way this one reads. Jesus, as he often does, transcends the question and helping them to recognize the bigger picture at stake here. So having this perhaps hypothetical but nonetheless vexing word problem that they throw out to him, Jesus says to them in verse 34, "Those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage." All right, that's the way it happens in the world we live in, he says. "But those who are considered worthy of a place in that age and in the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage." Now, what does this mean? Well, a couple things, I think. One, what he's saying at one level is that the concerns that they have raised, the issues of social organization and marriage laws that are applicable to the here and now, do not have a purpose in the age that is to come, that is, in the age of the resurrection. Because nobody's going to be keeping track of who was married to who in that day in that way. There's a much bigger picture that's going on here. And so it's surely unapplicable that you would even have to wrestle with that. It's perhaps easier to say that Jesus is arguing that the conditions of this present age do not obtain after the resurrection. Whose will she be then? Part of what ought to strike our modern sensibilities in this question is the notion of possession, right? Women within the Levirate marriage contract were treated very customarily as possessions. It was the man's obligation to this, but what right does the woman have to say, look, I did marry that brother, but I find your little brother to be wholly unacceptable, and I find this one to be deplorable, and this one to be any number of things. What right does she have in this way? By answering the question as Jesus does, and I find this really fascinating because I had not always thought about it in this way, I confess. But by answering as he does, pointing to the larger sense of resurrection life, not only is it not applicable that these same laws of expectation, because one, the whole point of the other brother marrying the wife was for the sake of procreation. Well, nobody needs to do that. No one's needing to continue the line of the ancestry in the kingdom that is to come after in the post-resurrection. So the very thing that made that law applicable, or at least inspired in some way, that motivation no longer holds in the coming kingdom. So that question doesn't even apply. But the second, I think, and more fascinating thing is to say that in the resurrection, a woman is not going to be, in this setting, is not to be given in marriage. Because to be given in marriage obviously implies a tremendous amount of subjection to another. And those standards need not apply in the life of the resurrection. In the kingdom that is to come, it's not the father who gives you like a piece of property, and it's not the groom who takes you as if you were a possession. And in the kingdom to come, in an order of peace and a world of justice and a kingdom of freedom, people are not given to others. So the question of the Sadducees, who will she belong to in the kingdom of heaven? Well, the answer, if these 7 brothers are all that we have to choose from, the answer is none of them. Because our common perception, and when I say our, I mean those of the first century in which Jesus is responding, the customs of that age and the laws that were applicable to that do not apply to the kingdom of God, where folks are not treated as possessions, women in particular are not bartered for as commodities or goods. Nobody is given for marriage, and no husband has the right to take her in marriage because she's a child of God in the kingdom that is to come. And her purpose is about something far greater than mere means of procreation. Okay? So all of the concerns that were operational for the Sadducees in this discussion are not applicable to the kingdom that is to come post-resurrection. As you read that answer and Jesus' response over and over and over, I hope that will become clear to you as we think. As Jesus says clearly in verse 35, those who are considered worthy of a place in that age and in the resurrection from the dead, they neither marry, because they need not do so for the purposes of procreation or fulfillment or even relationship, nor are they given in marriage. That is, they're not treated as commodities as women were in those days. Indeed, they cannot die anymore because they are like angels and are children of God, being children of the resurrection. So it's not that we're trying to give track of who's a husband and who's a wife in this stage, but we all are entered into a new status, merely reminded of our place as children of God. And isn't that something? I think this passage is applicable in many ways to a lot of the other kind of considerations and questions that we often ask ourselves. The Apostle Paul speaks to some of these other interests in 1 Corinthians 15, if you want another cross-reference. But, I can remember shortly after my grandfather died, and before I was really even a Christian, or maybe shortly thereafter, I was 11 years old when my grandfather died, and somewhere around the age of 13 and 14, I can remember riding in the car one day and turning to a friend of mine and going, am I going to recognize my granddaddy when I get to heaven? Because the way I remember him is with a rather rotund figure, and he never wore a shirt, and he never bothered to wear his teeth, and he didn't have a whole lot of hair. Now, that's the image of him that I remember, and that's the image that I love. But I don't know that that's the image that he would choose for himself as a part of the kingdom of God. I suspect he might want to be like 19 or 20, and a little better condition than the way that I remember him as one who eventually died of lung cancer. So all of those sort of questions, how old will I look? Will I have the body that I had in my youth, or one that looks like the way I died? Jesus does not attempt to answer any of these questions that you and I are so interested in, maybe perhaps even as a part of our own vanity. What he is inviting to do is simply to trust the God who has made all things and who will make the kingdom come to pass. That is the big message for Jesus. If he can just convince these Sadducees that the kingdom will come to pass, it might greatly relativize a lot of our other anxieties and concerns of the present age. And I think we can appreciate the many ways in which that is good news for us all and applied in any number of circumstances. He then moves on to a secondary illustration in verse 37. And the fact that the dead are raised, Moses himself showed. Now, this is where he's pushing the Sadducees on their reading and their interpretation of the notion of resurrection, because they're looking at Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy for their resource on the authority and understanding and doctrine of resurrection. And they're reading Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers. Thank you, I got that wrong. Anyway, look in the front of your Bible, check out the first 5 books. He's looking at these going, I don't see a whole lot of evidence of resurrection here. And Jesus is once again re-examining and inviting them to reinterpret their own understanding of the faith. He's saying, I see your consideration, but remember what Moses said there in Exodus chapter 3 on this grand scene of the burning bush, right? The Lord comes and says, and Moses himself showed in the story of the bush, where he speaks of the Lord as the God of who? The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, notice Jesus' implied teaching here is that when Moses declares this Yahweh, this I am, as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, he's not speaking in the past tense. He is saying that these people are still believing and still receiving the goodness of God and the presence of God as our ancestors of the faith and those faithful therein. As he follows up to say in verse 38, now he is God not of the dead, but of the living, for to him, that is Moses, all of these others, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, some of whom had died in the flesh, were in fact very much alive. Well, how can that be, he says, apart from the resurrection? Because guess what? Dead people don't need a God. If you're just dead and that's all there is to it, there's nothing beyond it, then the discussion of theology is a rather moot point. The question of who is your God no longer applies. But yet, even the Sadducees themselves would have affirmed Moses' testimony of this is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not was, but is. And if it is, well, they must be alive. Now, aren't they? And so it is fascinating to me, because I have not always thought about it in this way, the way in which that statement alone, which is such a rehearsed declaration of the Hebrew faith, is in fact an implicit record of resurrection faith. And that Moses had attributed this, perhaps unknowingly, but almost something that we would take for granted. Like, well, obviously, they're still alive and well in the images, in the presence of Almighty Creator God. So Jesus holds that image up to the Sadducees as a way of saying, friends, I would invite you to reconsider your question and doubts about the resurrection, because in fact, your very own tradition has affirmed this idea for years now. In response to that, in verse 40, perhaps they were still sad, you see. However, in verse 40 it says, first of all, they looked at him. Some of the scribes answered, "Teacher, you have spoken well." Like, hey man, you might have a point there. That's pretty good. I'm going to have to think about that a little further. I'm going to have to chew on that and take it home and really pray on that one. And the others, verse 40, it says, "For they no longer dared to ask him another question." Whew. So that's 3 rounds that Jesus has been through with the chief priests and scribes and the Pharisees and now the Sadducees, all these different groups coming up going, well, let me roll up my sleeves and let me take my shots at him and see what happens. Every time he's able to stand with brilliant interpretation, authority as one, obviously the very Word made flesh to dwell among us, who is not only, as he's presented in Matthew's gospel, not only the best teacher of the law, not only the best interpreter of the law, but as Matthew's gospel makes clear, he is the very personification of the Torah, that is the law itself. So it's not just, I know the law better than you. It's not just, I'm able to apply it and interpret better than you. What he's essentially saying is, friend, I am the law. I'm the guy. Everything the law points to, I am. Matthew makes that point even more dramatically and persistently throughout his gospel. But in Luke's way, it definitely has a way of clearing the threshing floor to help them reconsider the authority of Jesus at this most critical time. So we have a series of stories that are really presented to help us get a sense of the bigger picture. All of the minor concerns that we have and the games that we might play around legalisms and other ticky-tack matters of interpretation that we use to try to stumble each other up. Jesus says, no, I got a bigger plan for that. If you'll just understand that the kingdom is coming and you'll trust me with the results of that, some of the things that you're wondering about are really not terribly important right now. There's a greater sense of urgency the closer we get to the cross. Then in verse 41, Jesus turns the tables and he asks a question for them. Verse 41, again, this is a bigger picture sort of conversation. He said to them, how can they say, and they being they, how can they say that the Messiah is David's son? Which indeed they have. For David himself says in the book of Psalms, and Jesus is quoting here Psalm 110, verse 1. In the book of Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. That is, my Lord, capital L Lord, said to my Lord, lowercase Lord, that is King David, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. David thus calls him Lord. So how can he be his son? Now, what he's saying is yes, Jesus, the notion of Jesus as part of the lineage of David is an important understanding because it's one of the real cruxes of messianic prophecy, this idea that the Messiah will come from the line and lineage of David. And so he's asking this question. So he's not saying that the Son of God or the Messiah would not be derived from the lineage of David, but what he's saying is, isn't it something that this one who is derived from David, David even then referred to as the Messiah, referred to as Lord? And so that may not work terribly consistently in our notion of family trees, but it does work powerfully in recognizing that there's a much bigger picture here at work. David thus calls him Lord, so how can he be his son? Well, he can be because God is awesome. That's how. If you go back and look at 2 Samuel chapter 7, I think, verses 8 through 16, you see that covenant that was made with David. And you see the promise of the lineage, and you see the promise that God's steadfast love would stay with David all the days of his life, and that his kingdom would rule forever. And there's even reference there of the notion that there would be one even after David's days, that his kingdom would be sustained, in fact, enhanced and glorified through the lineage of what David was about to do. David didn't understand all this, I'm sure, when he heard it. But it's interesting that 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 8 through 16, is actually, in many years, one of the primary readings for the Old Testament lesson for the fourth Sunday in Advent. Right? The church has historically examined that passage as a sign of messianic expectation and helping to connect the dots of what God has been up to all along, and with David certainly a part of that story. So again, Jesus is saying the Messiah is a part of the bigger picture. He is both descendant of David and also Lord of David. And even David recognizes that what God is up to here is something far more important than just the restoration of David's political kingdom. There was so much hope among the people of Israel that one day David's kingdom would be restored. And what Jesus is saying in that moment, and we'll certainly expand this idea and stretch it even further in the Acts of the Apostles, is that God is up to something that is much bigger than just the restoration of David. It's much bigger than just this tribe we call Israel, but God is actually up for the reconciliation and the salvation of the entire world, both Jew and Gentile alike. So to only say, and I think this is important to hear as well, for any religious group to only say, boy, if we can just get it restored back to the way we used to have it in the good old days, then everything will be just so. The scriptures tell us that vision is entirely too narrow for the gospel good. And so I think we'll leave that as it is for what it is, but to recognize that this is about more than just the restoration of David's kingdom. This is about the Lord of all creation. And then in verse 45 through chapter 21, verse 4, again, this is Luke's way of pairing things. And sometimes in our the way that the passages are divvied up in the chapters and verses, occasionally do disservice because they make it look like there's two separate stories happening here. And Luke's intention, I believe, in this case, is that these two, the end of chapter 20 and the beginning of chapter 21, need not be spliced and diced, but actually go together quite well. And they serve as sort of mirror images. Once again, it's a great image coming here about this grand reversal that the kingdom brings. So let's hear it. Having had all of these bouts with these different, scribes and Pharisees and Sadducees, in the hearing of all the people, verse 45, Jesus said to the disciples, "Beware the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and the place of honor at the banquets." Now, sometimes I like to watch shows, the period pieces about whether it's medieval England or the medieval days of the formation before Reformation, or the Catholic priests, or whoever it is. There's always those priest figures who are like this, whispering in the king's ear, figuring out how to keep the kingdom of the moment in place, and who are doing so in the name of the church and blessing things that don't necessarily need to be blessed, and making political maneuverings in a way that tend to benefit the priests themselves. And I can think of several shows that have this illustration. I always get entranced by that because rarely are the priests terribly pure in all of these shows. Occasionally you'll find one where someone stands up well, but more often than not, the priests and the kings in these historical dramas are often in cahoots in ways that are not terribly godly, we might say, and oftentimes the king will say, well, I'm not real sure I can get away with this or justify it. Let me ask the priest. And the priest will say, oh, yeah, that'll work fine as long as we get a new wing added on to the cathedral and a few more dollars in the coffers. I'm sure that we can find a way to bless this, whether it's, your 14th marriage or whatever it is. Whatever it is the king wants done, the priest is there to make a deal in some way in some of those dramas. Here again, when I hear this denouncement from Jesus, I can't help but think about all those different images. Beware of those who are dressed the part. Beware of those who are looking the part, who long to make a name for themselves, who are benefiting mightily from the status that they have achieved in the marketplace, and have the best seats in the synagogues, make sure they got a bird's eye view of everything, and who insist on having places of honor at the banquets. Jesus has already had enough conversations about where to sit at the banquet table in the previous lesson, so I will call those back to your attention. He said, beware of these so-called religious leaders, these charlatans, if you will, because in the end, by their own desire for wealth and status and power, they will inevitably become the oppressor, and they are inevitably turning a blind eye to the needs of the poor in the streets. They will devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance, they will say long prayers, right? Who among us has not been guilty of that in some way? They will receive the greater condemnation. Why is that? Well, because they're supposed to know better. If anybody was supposed to help pursue justice and peace and equality and releasing the captives and recovery of sight to the blind and good news to the poor, if anybody was expected to do that within the establishment, it should have come from the priests. It should have come from those who are advocating as servants of God. And if they're not going to take that prophetic stand, if they're not going to continue to call advocacy to the places of power and to the seats and the thrones of establishment, then who will, right? What are you there for if not to do that? That is to say, they've not taken the role of the prophets. They've rather allowed it to pad their own bank accounts. They will receive the greater condemnation. That is to say, the very people that you expected to do the right thing, when they don't, what happens, right? Jesus says they're brought down low. And then, having done that, this is such a Lucan move here, he then tells a story about one who society says is not worth much. And what does Jesus do in Luke? He elevates this woman as an example for us all. This poor widow, right, who no one else would claim or support. He looked up in verse 1, Jesus is there in the temple, and he saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury, which is fine. But then he also saw a poor woman put in 2 small copper coins. He said, truly I tell you, this poor woman has put in more than all of them. Now, initially, somebody on the finance team for that temple and synagogue jumped up and did a quick count and said, Jesus, I don't know if your math is all that good, because this person put in, this much, and this woman put in 2 copper coins. And he said, no, she put in more. And it is a reflection of her proportionate sacrifice. These folks may have put in $1 million over here, but truth be told, it may have been 1% of what they had, and they're not going to miss it one way or the other. They were able to do it, and it looks good on paper, and it made them feel better, and they could say that they got credit for it on their bank statements and their tax returns and whatever else. But proportionately, there was nothing compared to what this woman had and what she didn't have, and yet continued to offer as a means of sacrifice. What she put in is not enough to get her name on a plaque. What she put in is not enough to get some building named after her. No one's going to remember what she put in, Jesus says. That is, unless I lift it up right now and tell you the real value of what that gift is. It's a proportionate thing. Truly, I tell you, he said, this poor woman has put in more than all of them. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, has put in all she had to live in. Now, remember, this kingdom exemplifies a radically new character. This is a change. So here's yet another example in the Gospel of Luke, where those who are in a place of power, in this case, the priests, those who say long prayers with fancy robes in the marketplace, they are brought low in Jesus' assessment. And those who are merely just doing what's easy for them, they're sort of in the middle. Even though on paper it looks really good what they're doing. That's great, but they're not necessarily going to change the world with that level of commitment. Not in the capacity that God has perhaps blessed them to do. And then you have this other woman who is ready to give the best of herself because out of her poverty, she declares Jesus Christ as Lord, not only of her life, but also of her faith and her trust and her economic portfolio, and everything that she has is wholly dependent on who Jesus is in that space, in the life of the temple. This woman, he says, gets it. Her faith is richer, it is stronger, and she is indeed more liberated and more free than all of those who are still stretching, getting a cramp in their shoulders to pat themselves on the back for what they did proportionately. Again, the radically new character, the sense of dramatic reversal, and the realization that the kingdom looks very different than what we normally assess in our day-to-day goings-on in the temple. We'll continue on with the destruction of the temple foretold in the coming weeks. Things will really start to elevate in some of the imagery and symbolic language. Parables of the fig trees, continuing plots to kill Jesus. We put our pedal to the metal here a little bit, our foot to the pedal with regard to the controversy that drags Jesus up that hill and to the cross. I will be on vacation with my family for the next 2 weeks. And so we're going to take a little bit of hiatus for the remainder of the month of July. And I look forward to being back with you shortly thereafter at the beginning of August as we pick up these stories. So feel free, there's plenty of material there in the remaining few chapters of Luke's Gospel to go ahead and engage those fresh and anew as we'll look to unfold this dramatic display of God's power, even in the face of a lesser authority. So I hope this is of good news to you today. Let us be mindful of the ways that we receive the presence of change in our lives. Let us at least stop to ask, Lord, is this the change that you've initiated? Is this your kingdom? Is this a sign of your kingdom? Or is this something else? I don't have all the easy answers for you in that, but I do call us with each and every breath of our days to be able to examine faithfully and honestly where we are with respect to what God is up to in the world, and to be ever mindful of his love and preferential treatment for the poor, the orphan, and the widow. It's what Jesus has said to us and for us all along. I'll leave you with this thought from Jürgen Moltmann today. In no religion, he says, is the character of protest so vital as in the messianic faith of Christianity. This is what Jürgen Moltmann, a great theologian, said in 1969. He said, one cannot grasp freedom in faith without hearing simultaneously the categorical imperative that one must serve through bodily, social, and political obedience to the liberation of the suffering creation out of real affliction. That is to say, if our faith doesn't also do something, as James said, for the least of these, if our faith in Christ does not make a difference in the lives of those to whom Christ has come and is called, then we need to reevaluate that faith and ask ourselves once again, to whom do we belong as creatures of his? So I leave you with these challenging thoughts. I love you. I appreciate you. I look forward to seeing you again soon. We'll be with you soon enough. God bless. God's peace.